He dropped the guardianship papers on my kitchen table and smiled like he was doing me a favor. "You're too old to handle 19 million, hand it over." In that moment, the room shrank. The years I'd carried my family turned to kindling, and the man married to my daughter tried to erase me with a signature. That was the day I stopped being their ATM with a heartbeat and started fighting back, with records, with law, and with the one thing greed can't fake: the truth. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. Snow came to Sedona like a borrowed costume, thin, sparkling, and a little unsure of itself on the red rock shoulders. I watched it silver the adobe sill as evening crept in, the temperature dropping enough to turn my breath into small, private clouds. Inside, the house held the kind of warmth only an old place can keep. Pinon wood popping in the fireplace, orange light skating across hand-thrown tiles, the hum of a heater that's been dependable longer than most friendships. I set the table the way Ellen once liked it. Linen runner, the chipped green bowls that survived moves and arguments in my clumsy hands, then lifted the lid on the chili verde. Steam rose with the scent of roasted hatch, chiles, and cumin, as familiar to me as my own pulse. I am Samuel Whitaker, 68, retired from a life of pouring concrete and solving problems that could kill people if you misread a number. There was a time when I measured my days in rebar and regrade, in spans of steel across cold rivers. Now I measure them in miles walked at dawn, in the satisfaction of fixing a squeaky hinge, in the ordinary miracle of making dinner for the child who still calls this house home, even if she keeps her own set of keys. I talk to Ellen sometimes while the coffee drips, not because I expect an answer, but because the habit of speaking softly to what you lost is hard to break. Grief, I've learned, becomes a room you know better than your kitchen. You still bump into the corners. Olivia arrived first, cheeks pinked by the wind, a knit hat pulled low over hair she rarely takes the time to brush on holidays. She floated a kiss over my shoulder and drifted to the tree where old ornaments held our family's clumsy history. A wooden star I carved the year money was tight, a ceramic angel she made in 3rd grade with a crooked smile that never fails to win. She teaches art to children now part-time, a job that fills her with stories she never quite finishes because the emotions stack up faster than the words. I listened as I always do, feeling the familiar tug of pride at the way she makes small people brave with color. Derek followed with a practiced grin and a bottle of wine so aggressively labeled it might have sold itself on volume alone. He is the kind of man who compliments the light in a room as if light were a choice someone had made. He moved as though the house were a stage and he the only one who had bothered to learn his lines. I served bowls and passed warm tortillas wrapped in a towel, and he praised heat levels, seasoning, the balance of fat to acid with the confidence of a man auditioning for a job he gave himself. Once I thought that charm might be a bridge to something lasting. These days, it reads more like scaffolding around a building no one pulled permits for. We ate, and the plates grew messy in the happiest ways. Sauce slicking spoons, a cilantro leaf clinging to Olivia's wrist, laughter coming in little bursts that sounded like our old life. "Perfect," Derek said, and I nodded, choosing to accept the word at face value. I have learned that a holiday's integrity depends on what you refuse to examine too closely. I asked about their week, their boy, the winter program at Olivia's school. She described a papier-mâché parade of animals. He outlined a property idea with the bright edges of a brochure. I kept my voice even, my questions small. Engineers, even retired ones, know the difference between a load-bearing claim and decorative trim. After dishes, I set out the coffee and the plate of biscochitos, sugared and smelling of anise. The old mantel clock counted 9 slow beats. I looked at the leather briefcase by my chair and made a decision to keep it closed. I had carried those documents all day and felt their weight change as the sun moved. I had also promised myself to protect what needed protecting. There are conversations that belong to accountants and lawyers and quiet mornings when everyone has slept. Tonight was for remembering how we sit together without breaking the chair. We moved to the living room where the tree lights made everything kinder. Olivia tucked her feet under her like she did as a teenager, the dog claiming her ankles with proprietary satisfaction. Derek angled himself where he could see the fireplace and the room in one glance, a habit I recognized from men who prefer to stand with their back to no door. Outside, wind pushed a thin curtain of white along the yard. Inside, warmth smoothed the edges of my thoughts. I let myself inventory the things I could still fix. Rattling vent, finicky dimmer, the hinge on the hall closet that always protested. I left the other list, the one that begins with money and ends with trust, folded and put away. If I have a failing, it is that I assume careful planning can make people reasonable. In construction, you can add bracing and widen footings, and the span will hold. Families aren't bridges, they're weather. They change while you're measuring. Sitting there, I traced the wood grain on the arm of my chair and felt as surely as cold finds glass that a shift was coming. I didn't know its shape yet, only that every small piece carries a cost and every cost comes due. We exchanged modest gifts, the kind chosen by hands that know the size of each other's pockets. Olivia gave me a leather notebook and said softly, "For your morning walks." I said thank you. Derek presented a stainless steel pour-over set and praised its precision. I said, "Looks solid." The dog snored like distant thunder. The room breathed. Later, when the house had settled and the light slid lower against the walls, I rinsed the coffee cups and stacked them with the patience of a man who has learned to let water do the first half of the work. I dried the green bowls, placed them back like returning birds, and wiped the counter in slow, even passes. Back in the living room, the briefcase waited by the chair. I left it there. Tomorrow could carry its own weight. Tonight, I walked to the window and watched the snow spend itself on the stone, a quiet ledger balancing out in white. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of how one family secret can shatter years of trust, please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2. The accident happened with the quiet inevitability of a bead rolling off a string. I was clearing plates when Derek brushed past my chair to comment on a painting, his elbow catching the edge of the leather briefcase I had promised myself not to open. It toppled, landed on its spine, and popped like a book giving up a secret. A sheaf slid out, face down at first, then turned under its own curl to show a page I knew by weight and watermark alone. Schedule of assets. The number did not shout. It simply existed in black, tidy font. 19 million, like a door left unlatched. Olivia reached it before I did because daughters still move faster than fathers when glass is falling. She skimmed the heading, then stopped, eyes trying to reconcile digits with the life she knew I led. Sturdy, careful, built on the satisfaction of paying bills on time. She looked up and I saw wonder first, then calculation flicker across her face like a cloud's shadow, then something softer that made me wish I could keep her small another minute. Derek's posture adjusted by degrees, the way a man leans into a wind that will carry him if he frames his sail correctly. He did not touch the page. He did not need to. I gathered the papers and admitted what dignity allowed. My Aunt Lila, the one who believed good frames could save bad paintings, had left me a portfolio built over decades. Bonds that slept and paid, stocks that behaved like sturdy cousins, a modest interest in the Uptown Gallery because she had a soft spot for late bloomers. I said I had not told anyone yet because telling changes the thing being told. I said the words carefully, like bolts I did not want to strip, and waited for them to settle. Olivia asked about Aunt Lila's will, her gallery, the students who might benefit from scholarships in her name. I heard the person she has always been, a collector of small lights. Derek praised Aunt Lila's foresight and the power of capital to amplify good intent. He spoke about efficient structures and how money grows best when allowed to breathe, and I recognized the tone of men who have learned that certainty sells even when certainty is a costume. I told them I was exploring a family trust with conditions and independent oversight, and a foundation to keep Lila's name guarding the doors of young artists who lacked better guards. I watched the way Derek's jaw tightened at the word oversight, how he smiled to cover it, how the smile did not reach his eyes. The room remained warm, Pinot burning, small ornaments winking, but the temperature inside my ribs fell half a degree. I said we would talk more in the new year with coffee, with clear heads, and Derek said, of course, naturally, it was only that opportunities do not wait for holiday hangovers to pass. Olivia squeezed my arm as if to ask for patience on all sides. I said yes to the squeeze and no to the now. I refiled the papers, checked the clasp twice, and slid the briefcase under my chair. We returned to safer sentences, the kind that keep rooms whole. Later, alone with the dishwasher's hushed argument, I replayed the angles in Derek's voice. Engineers survive on patterns, the way steel telegraphs fatigue, the sound fresh asphalt makes under a rolling pin, the math of rain against slope. Families have patterns too. You ignore them at your peril. I wiped the counter until it shone, then stood at the window and watched wind sweep a veil of snow off the red rock, revealing color beneath as if the land were remembering its own name. In bed, I tested the weight of choices like a bridge tests its piers when the river runs high. There is a kind of love that rushes to satisfy, that builds ramps over every difficulty and calls the result kindness. I have practiced that love and found it dangerous. Another kind sets boundaries and accepts blame for the discomfort boundaries cause. It looks like stinginess to people who profit from fog. I have worn that accusation too and found it survivable. Somewhere between those shores, I would have to moor this new reality before it drifted into someone else's harbor. Around midnight, the house clicked and sighed as familiar systems settled. I listened to the heater cycle and let its discipline reassure me. I thought of Aunt Lila, of the way she would tilt her head when a young painter tried to seduce her with gloss. "Show me your edges," she'd say. "Edges tell the truth." I considered the edges I had glimpsed tonight, Olivia's startled tenderness, Derek's hunger hiding in courtesy. I could not blame appetite. I could choose what it would and would not be allowed to consume. Sometime after 1, I rose and fetched the briefcase from its place by the chair. I did not open it. I laid it on the dresser where the moonlight could wash over it and take no print. Then I returned to bed and rehearsed a conversation with my lawyer that emphasized process over panic. When morning finally knitted itself to my blinds, I felt older than I had the night before, which is another way of saying I felt exactly my age. I made coffee, cracked the window to let in a blade of cold air, and told the day I was ready for it, whether or not it was ready for me. If you're still watching and starting to sense how a small crack in loyalty can widen into betrayal, please comment number 2 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 3. Morning rose thin and metallic over the red rocks, and I decided to protect ceremony as if it were a joist under strain. I reheated chili, warmed tortillas, laid out the same green bowls, and invited quiet to hold the room steady. For several minutes it worked. Spoons against ceramic, the dog's hopeful sighs, the clock dividing time into solvable pieces. Then Derek's voice stepped forward with the eagerness of a salesman who has practiced in mirrors. He painted a creekside opportunity that would not wait, insisting capital must move before January cooled it. His sentences wore the urgency of a man running ahead of his math. Olivia added pictures of a studio, space for their son, a life smoothed by square footage. I heard legitimate hope braided with someone else's acceleration. I kept my tone level, described a family trust with independent oversight, distributions aligned to needs that could be explained in the dark, and a foundation in Lila's name that pointed money outward. Derek called oversight a velvet chain and suggested that men my age often mistake control for care. I let the insult pass like weather across a canyon wall. Ritual became truce. I stacked plates, slowed my hands, refused to let appetite set tempo. He argued that delay kills momentum. I answered that unmeasured momentum is only momentum toward the edge. Olivia laid a calming hand on his sleeve without contradiction. In the gesture, I recognized her tenderness and its risk. I ended the exchange by fixing Monday on the calendar, a lawyer present, a plan on paper, signatures where the state prefers certainty. After they left, I walked the Arroyo Loop until the cold bit as cleanly as a plumb line. Back home, I called Aisha Benitez, asked for trust documents, foundation bylaws, a durable power that did not reward confusion. Before dusk, I slid the briefcase out of sight. Money could exist in my house. It would not be allowed to decorate the air we breathed. If you're still watching and realizing how quickly a family bond can turn into a battlefield over money, please comment number 3 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to Chapter 4. Aisha's office felt engineered for oxygen. Clear surfaces, paper where paper belonged, a window framing a slice of Sedona sky as if to remind clients that weather always moves on. She greeted me without the performative sympathy lawyers sometimes adopt, and I was grateful. We sat side by side at a table that looked like it preferred numbers to adjectives. She opened a legal pad and began building a structure one beam at a time. Family trust, corporate trustee, distribution triggers keyed to real needs rather than impulses, audit trails that didn't care about moods. She spoke in verbs: establish, segregate, document, review. My chest loosened at the grammar of it. We mapped a foundation in Lila's name that would not be a vanity shelf. Bylaws, a mission narrow enough to be useful, a committee that outlived personalities, conflict of interest rules that barred me from playing hero. Aisha suggested a durable power of attorney that protected me from the most ordinary disaster of age, other people's plans. It would sit in a folder and gather dust until needed, and that would be our definition of success. One more thing, she said, scrolling through her calendar, a cognitive evaluation, not theater, guardrail. I nodded. Engineer's proof test spans before the river rises. She booked me with Dr. Priyanka Rao for Friday at 10 and underlined the time twice. Back home, I pulled the banker's boxes from the closet and set my favorite tools on the dining table. A pencil sharp enough to cut, yellow pads, binder clips, a small stapler that punches clean holes in chaos. I built a ledger of the last 8 years of assistance. Tuition put on my card when timing was bad, rent when Derek's project missed cash flow. Clinic bills, those emergencies that return quarterly the way storms return by season. Each line had a date, an amount, a purpose, a confirmation number, because I have always trusted the sound a receipt makes more than any speech. The totals added up to a truth I'd been refusing to say out loud. I had subsidized a narrative labeled love. Love should not require monthly wiring instructions. Toward evening, Derek texted, timing casual, content firm. He arrived with the bright posture of a man selling optimism to himself. He praised the house's warmth, the view, the way winter light flatters even flawed art. The compliments felt like foam around something heavier. He unveiled a bridge opportunity, $250,000, to capture short-term upside in a hospitality property he described as overlooked, undervalued, and obliging enough to repay itself within months. The deck on his tablet loved arrows and the future perfect tense. I listened the way you listen to a storm forecast from someone who never learned topography. I won't do cash, I said, keeping my voice where the room could rest on it. Only targeted support through a trust or grant with reporting. He smiled the way people smile at children buckled into car seats, said structure kills oxygen, said a nimble window was closing. I repeated the policy not because I expected him to applaud, but because policies exist for the days you're tempted to make exceptions. He glanced toward the briefcase as if it might open on command. When he left, the room regained an inch of altitude. That night, I kept working, not to outrun the problem, but to tire it out. I added tabs to folders and dates to tabs. I drafted a letter to the gallery manager explaining the outline of the foundation and asking for a Saturday slot Olivia could use if she wanted to teach. The language did not beg or scold, it offered a process. Close to midnight, my laptop chimed. A message wearing my brokerage's colors asked me to confirm credentials to prevent temporary restriction. Even half-tired, I could hear counterfeit in the cadence. The sender domain was off by a syllable. The reply to wasn't ours. The footer carried the faint chemical smell of mass production. I did not click. I pulled full headers, saved them, and forwarded everything to Aisha with 3 lines of context. Within minutes, she replied, attaching our forensic consultant in a CC that felt like a safety harness. I brewed tea and stood by the window, watching the streetlight lay a careful rectangle across the floor. The dog came to lean against my shin, a small animal practicing ballast. I considered that greed in a tie looks different from greed in a hoodie, but both prefer dark corners. We had just turned on a light. Morning arrived with frost scribbled on the glass and a phone call from Dr. Rao's office confirming Friday's appointment. I walked early, the arroyo holding a thin thread of ice where water liked to insist on its movement. Back home, I cleaned the coffee machine because maintaining small systems is a way to keep large fears from claiming the whole day. Aisha texted at 9, preliminary trace pointed toward an LLC registered in Texas, a shell that hosted a grab bag of opportunism. "We're not speculating," her message ended. "We're documenting." I exhaled. Documentation is the opposite of theater. It requests no audience. At 10, I sat at my desk and scanned signatures into folders that matched the motion Aisha would draft. Transfer confirmations marched in straight lines. My portfolio's conservative slope looked like a road that chose stability over scenic overlooks. I added a note to myself to send a thank you to the accountant who had played the long game with my patience and my dividends. It is easy to believe you've outsmarted a market. It is better to admit you simply stayed awake. That afternoon, Olivia called about paint for her students. She sounded like someone who had been carrying 2 buckets and set one down. I told her the foundation charter would name supplies in its first grants. She laughed softly, the way people laugh when relief surprises them. I held the sound in my hands for a moment before putting it where it belonged. By sunset, the day had become useful in the way good forms become useful. You stop noticing them and begin to trust what they hold up. I labeled the last binder and slid it onto the shelf. The house breathed its small creaks. The heater exhaled and rested. I took the chisel to a scrap of mesquite until a ribbon curled like handwriting from a steadier self. When I set the tool down, I realized I had not thought about Derek's window or his decks in hours. I had been building something else, a series of decisions I wouldn't have to remake in a storm. Before bed, I printed the appointment confirmation for Dr. Rao and placed it on the counter where morning would find it without thinking. I checked the doors not because I feared thieves, but because closing what needs closing is a ritual I trust. In the dark, the house made the same honest noises it made when life was simpler. I said a sentence into the quiet, "Forms first," and let sleep come like a slow pour that doesn't trap air. If you're still watching and seeing how even the first attempts at peace can deepen the wound, please comment number 4 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 5. The man with the clipboard had the calm of someone who delivers detonations for a living. He verified my name, handed over a packet heavy with accusation, and wished me a good afternoon like weather. The caption on top read, "Petition to appoint guardian," the courthouse way of saying someone had decided I no longer belonged at the wheel of my own life. Inside, a letter from a surgeon, bones, not brains, offered opinions about my mind, and a stack of neighbor statements suggested I was drifting. Mail untaken, conversations with nobody, lights left on in rooms I wasn't in. None of it matched the man reading those pages, but paper doesn't blush when it lies. By the time the front door clicked shut, my checking account and a modest investment sleeve were restricted pending determination. Precaution, the bank called it, like taping a mouth to save it from speaking. I set the packet on the table and made tea because the body needs hot water when the ground shifts. The dog leaned into my shin and steadied me more than he knew. I texted Aisha a single line, "Receive service," and the photograph of the caption page. Her reply came fast, "Sit tight. We'll pull the teeth out of it." The next hour taught me how quickly a rumor decides it prefers being a broadcast. A post bloomed on a neighborhood forum. Sad pantry, overdue bills. The phrase, elder neglect, hovering over a caption that suggested I had chosen money over blood. The images were composed with commercial care. Empty shelves arranged like theater, a past due notice angled to catch light, a child's cereal bowl placed just so. I took screenshots with timestamps and put the phone down. If I let adrenaline choose my sentences, I would say things I'd later have to sand smooth. Aisha called while I was labeling files. "We'll move to dismiss," she said, her voice trimmed of everything but function. "Dr. Rao's evaluation goes in full. I want your portfolio performance in simple charts, transfers documented to the penny, and a declaration from your accountant. We'll also preserve an anti-SLA-PP claim. Don't respond online." I told her I would not give the fire air. "Good," she said. "We'll show the court the hydrants." I pulled the records I've always kept, because bridges don't stand on candor alone. Tuition payments, rent coverages, clinic invoices, those emergencies apps that are only emergencies because someone never planned for ordinary bumps. Each had a date and a confirmation. I plotted the investment account's slow, disciplined climb and printed the graph in monochrome so it would read like a road, not a celebration. I signed a declaration that sounded like me, plain, direct, unwilling to dramatize. By evening, a meeting at the Uptown Merchants Association put me in a fluorescent room full of folding chairs and the kind of people who keep a town from becoming only its postcards. Derek was already there, posture tuned to sympathy, words about elder safety and family duty stacked like sandbags. He never used my name, which is a way to shrink a person without appearing to. When the chair offered me 3 minutes, I took 2.5. I showed the ledger, education, rent, medical, each line backed by a confirmation. I displayed one email in which Derek proposed pledging my municipal bonds to unlock time value, a euphemism for borrowing against patience. I didn't raise my voice. Evidence doesn't need volume. It needs oxygen withheld from theater. The room's temperature changed by a degree only the honest notice. People look down at their hands because hands don't lie. He tried again with a tone pitched between indignation and concern. I let the chair close the item. On the sidewalk after, a shop owner who sells jewelry made from river stones walked beside me a block and said nothing, then squeezed my forearm once and crossed the street. Not all support speaks in nouns. At home, I sharpened a chisel because steel accepts focus better than a mind humming with the need to answer. The shavings came off in thin, obedient curls that looked like the handwriting of a calmer version of me. I put tools away, checked the back door, and stood a moment in the living room where Aunt Lila's favorite small painting hangs, a wash of charcoal and light that refuses to resolve into anything but honesty. I told myself what I tell a crew before a pour: trust the forms you've built. The set will come if you don't rush it. The following morning began with a call from the banker, contrite and brisk. "Mr. Whitaker, we've flagged the restrictions for expedited review," he said, careful to sound thorough without admitting panic. I told him thorough was all I wanted. Next came Aisha's draft motion, declarations numbered, exhibits tabbed, Dr. Rao's report distilled without losing muscle. She filed it by noon with a request for fees and a note preserving our right to respond if the drama migrated back online. "We will be dull," she wrote in the email below. "Judges reward dull." Then came a different kind of weather. A neighbor who had avoided me in the cereal aisle the week before met my eyes and said, "You're looking steady." The mail brought a postcard thank you from the Art Center for a small donation in Lila's name. Underneath the printed message, someone had written, "Edges tell the truth." I set it on the counter and let it steady me the way a plumb line steadies a long cut. Late afternoon, Derek's latest performance appeared. Carefully phrased concerns about my recent confusion, the kind of language designed to be walked back as misunderstanding when called to account. I did nothing except forward the link to Aisha with the subject line "Pattern Continues" and a photo of the ledger page where his bridge loan request sat. She replied, "Logged, no response. Pace remains ours." Night arrived with its honest chores. I emptied the dishwasher, folded the towel with the green stripe Ellen used to like, and stood at the window long enough to watch the last light peel away from the rocks. This was the part no one ever films, the handful of hours where you decline to participate in someone else's acceleration, where you pick up your own life at the same measured speed as yesterday and let the record carry the argument. I locked the door and turned off the lamp and said a small sentence to the dark, hold, which is what I have always asked of structures and what I was finally learning to ask of myself. Courthouse mornings carry their own weather, air thinned by anxiety, light filtered through glass that turns faces colorless. I arrived early with Aisha, who moved like a person whose oxygen is procedure. We sat outside Department C while clerks ferried files in stacks that could have been firewood. I studied the calendar, the names, the ordinary grind of strangers' collisions, and reminded myself that calm, like concrete, cures if you leave it be. Aisha reviewed our packet, Dr. Rao's evaluation with percentiles circled, portfolio reports rendered in plain lines, declarations from my accountant and neighbors who know the difference between absent-minded and absent. "We will be dull," she said. "Judges reward dull." I nodded. Dull is honesty without perfume. Derek arrived in a suit that shone when it shouldn't, Olivia half a step behind him, eyes red the way wind reddens stone. The attorney at his side shuffled papers with the sound of confidence borrowed for the hour. When the bailiff called our case, the room settled into the ritual that lets adversaries speak without weapons. Derek's counsel opened on concern and family obligation, skating toward a portrait of a man slipping, then pivoted to medical necessity and finally to urgency. He held up a letter signed by a surgeon whose specialty had nothing to do with minds. Aisha objected. The judge glanced down, then up, expression arranged in neutrality, so practiced it might as well have been marble. Our turn came without flourish. Aisha stood at a polite distance from drama and laid out facts. Dr. Rao's credentialing, the scope of her exam, the scores that did not need adjectives, a lifetime of tax returns without late fees, transfers documented to the penny, investment performance that would embarrass most funds, not because I am clever, but because I am patient. She did not raise her voice. She let paper do the heavy lifting. Neutrality softened a shade. The petition's medical exhibit was struck as unreliable. The hearsay community statements fell in a small cascade after it. The judge asked why a guardianship and atomic option had been chosen before any lesser tool. Derek's attorney cited escalating concern. The judge asked for dates and got fog. Fog does not impress people who drive their days on narrow roads. The petition was denied without prejudice, which is a courthouse way of saying you brought the wrong tool to the wrong job. Fees were reserved. Aisha breathed in the way divers do when they break surface. I thanked the court with the humility reinforced concrete uses when a load test holds. In the hallway, Derek smoothed his tie as if order could be ironed back into a morning. Olivia stood between us, a compass needle tugged by two magnets. I looked at her, not through her. "I will fund a scholarship in your son's name and support your work," I said, "but I won't build a bridge to panic. Separate accounts, a plan to repay what's past, counseling for debt. Then we can talk about distributions as if they were tools, not gifts." My voice surprised me by not shaking. Derek's mouth shaped a smile without selecting sincerity. "It reads like control." Aisha stepped half forward, but I lifted a hand. "It reads like accountability," I said. "I have been generous without ledger and called it love. That does not scale." Olivia's gaze moved from Derek's jaw to my hands. She reached, did not touch, then folded her own. "Dad," she said, barely above a whisper, "do you trust me to do the right thing if I stand alone?" "I do," I said, because I had to say it for her to hear it inside herself. We stood in that thin air long enough to learn what we each weighed. Derek tugged at Olivia's elbow. "Let's go," he said. She did not move. The hallway ambient noise, vents, rubber heels, paper, magnified the pause into a canyon. "I need time," she said finally, each word placed like a stone where a footing might be. She looked at me again, and I saw the exact moment a daughter considers the cost of becoming a separate country. If love is geography, borders are not betrayals. They are maps. Outside, winter did its old practical work. Light glared off snow as if truth wanted to be seen. Aisha handed me a copy of the minute order. "We're filing our fee motion and preserving the record," she said. "Also, our investigator flagged a Texas LLC you will not be surprised by." I said I was tired. "You're allowed," she answered. "Tired is the body's receipt for a day spent carrying yourself." On the steps, Derek tried to reframe defeat as delay. "This isn't over," he said. I looked past him to the street where buses kept their schedules indifferent to private disasters. "No," I said, "it is not. But the part where you get to define me is." He flinched, just slightly, the way men do when a foundation refuses to settle under their jump. Olivia put 2 fingers on his sleeve, not to lead him, but to remind herself she had a hand. We walked to our separate cars. I drove home at the speed limits that make lives predictable, and when I reached my driveway, the red rocks lifted themselves into the kind of afternoon that refuses melodrama. I stood in the yard and breathed until breathing felt like a vote. Back inside, I checked the doors out of habit rather than fear, then sat at the table and wrote a list titled After. Lists are bridges in pencil. At the top, call Dr. Rao to thank her for doing her job the way jobs are meant to be done. Authorize Aisha to file the fee motion and to prepare a cease and desist for any further reputational theater. Schedule a visit with the gallery manager to formalize the foundation's launch beyond the reach of family weather. I added one more line because I needed to. Dinner with Olivia at week's end. No money talk, just soup. Not every repair is structural. Some are paint, done carefully because you plan to live with the color. Back inside, I checked the doors out of habit rather than fear, then sat at the table and wrote a list titled After. Lists are bridges in pencil. At the top, call Dr. Rao to thank her for doing her job the way jobs are meant to be done. Authorize Aisha to file the fee motion and to prepare a cease and desist for any further reputational theater. Schedule a visit with the gallery manager to formalize the foundation's launch beyond the reach of family weather. I added one more line because I needed to. Dinner with Olivia at week's end. No money talk, just soup. Not every repair is structural. Some are paint, done carefully because you plan to live with the color. When the light pivoted toward evening, I walked to the shed and oiled my chisels. Metal absorbs calm if you let it. I planed a strip of mesquite until the curls lay on the bench like proof that pressure, applied steadily, can make any surface honest. Somewhere in town, someone posted something unhelpful. Somewhere else, someone scrolled past. The day ended without a fire breaking out, which is a victory few people celebrate because nothing flashy happened. But I work in a currency that prefers the boring miracle. A span that holds, a wall that stays plumb, a man who did not let himself be defined by someone else's hurry. If you're still watching and feeling the tension of a choice that could end a family or save a legacy, please comment number 5 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. Consequences seldom announce themselves. They arrive in ordinary envelopes and awkward silences, wearing work boots. The first came as a voicemail from a contractor I respect, the kind of man who underpromises because he plans to last. He cleared his throat before speaking my name, and even through compressed audio I heard discomfort scuffing the floor. A client had called asking for a crew reassignment, no publicity, just prudence, and he was pressing pause on Derek. He apologized for the message more than its content. I saved it anyway. Records matter when memory is forced to carry too much. By afternoon, the smaller signals accumulated. The tennis group Derek loved for its brisk choreography of jokes and lungs posted a spring ladder without his name. A neutral administrator cited availability. The Uptown Merchant sent a meeting recap where my talk about Lila's gallery earned 2 lines of polite gratitude and no mention of the petition everyone had heard about. Gaps grew like hairline cracks that will, if ignored, invite weather to finish the job. There was no pleasure in watching them form. There was also no denial left in me to dull their meaning. Olivia arrived near dusk carrying a paper bag and a face that had made difficult choices all day. I put a pot on the stove and began pozole because soup forgives what people cannot. Steam opened the air between us. She sat at the counter and unfolded the kind of financial confessions that are both precise and vague, gentle phrases for balances, harder ones for interest, a list of charges that tried to resemble needs and failed. It took time. I stopped her only to hand napkins or to adjust the flame. When she finally looked up, her eyes had the clarity of someone who has run out of euphemism. "Dad," she said, "I didn't know how to name the hole." I said, "Holes earn names by depth." That was most of the dialogue we needed. We ate in long human quiet. The dog lay at our feet as if to pin the room to the floor. Later, in the office, I showed her the framework Aisha and I had drafted. A trust with conditions that protected her from sudden appetites, including mine. A foundation that would connect Lila's money to Sedona's young artists without detouring through our family weather. The option to apply for grants with clear milestones and reporting, the same standards I would have required of strangers. Olivia traced a clause with one finger, reading as if the words might flinch. "I can do this," she said. I believed her because she did not ask whether I believed her. Aisha's demand letter went out the next morning, a crisp packet that walked through misrepresentations and named consequences with calm vocabulary. It did not roar. It didn't need to. She attached a draft anti-slap motion, flagged the defamation posts, excerpted the motion to dismiss order, and closed with a line, "Only lawyers enjoy." Notice is hereby given. In parallel, Dr. Rao sent a letter that was almost tender in its refusal to be sentimental. Dates, instruments, percentiles, the absence of decline, stated without triumph. Science, at its best, sounds like kindness because it refuses to pretend. The community, being a community, behaved like weather with microclimates. At the grocery store, a neighbor who once confided recipes in the cereal aisle pretended not to see me. Two others waved and changed nothing. I made a choice. When people asked about drama, I would talk about Lila's students and leave the rest to the minutes of courtrooms built for that purpose. It was not nobility. It was accounting. You cannot spend dignity twice. Sedona Art Center hosted a small evening for donors and stubborn believers. I stood beside a painting Lila had bought from a college senior who could not believe anyone would pay for color arranged honestly. I spoke about her way of finding edges, how she listened for craft in a room full of noise, and about the foundation we would launch to keep that listening alive. No names, no grievances, only the geometry of a gift extended forward. People clapped with the kind of relief that audiences feel when a story chooses to end in repair. Afterward, an elderly sculptor squeezed my forearm and called Lila a woman who bought time for other people's courage. I drove home grateful for sentences that do not require me to stand in them. Derek's next attempt arrived by email at 1:14 a.m., time-stamped by insomnia and bravado. The subject line promised a mutually accretive opportunity. Inside, a pitch deck borrowed fonts from Optimism and numbers from Wish. He proposed leveraging my municipal bonds as collateral for a short-term note to seize an undervalued hospitality asset, then using projected cash flow to retire the note within 6 months. There were arrows, acronyms, and an exit that assumed gravity would suspend itself for goodwill. He CC'd no one, which told me even he sensed the paper would not pass light. I forwarded it to Aisha with a single sentence, "Please archive under pattern," and closed my laptop before the screen's light could convince me it was morning. The next days arranged themselves into a rhythm I could live with. Calls with Aisha that felt like tightening hardware. Emails with the gallery manager about bylaws. A walk each afternoon where I counted the steps between pin-owned shadows and found the number always reasonable. Olivia sent me a photo of a supply list for the children's class she wanted to build. Brushes, paper, a drying rack, a kettle for tea. The practicality made me proud. When she came by, we sanded a table in the garage together and didn't speak until the grain lifted like small waves and lay down again. "Teaching is slower than I thought," she said. "Slow is where it learns," I said. The dog sneezed sawdust and reminded us to laugh. Aisha texted a copy of a formal retraction posted under legal advice on a local forum where Derek's friends used to speculate. It was oddly worded and completely sufficient. The Texas LLC surfaced again in a note from our investigator, not as proof, but as a breadcrumb trail too deliberate to be accidental. We saved each breadcrumb. Documentation is patience in file form. One night I caught my reflection in the dark kitchen window, a man older than the last time he checked, a man not ruined by being older. I made tea, wrote my lists for the morning, called Dr. Rao to say thank you again, finalized the foundation's launch date, pick up the humidifier filter, buy paper for Olivia's class, and sat at the table where I have paid bills and buried grief and celebrated small mercies. Outside, Sedona returned to its habit of making every outline sharp. Inside, I practiced mine. Be clear, be steady, be kind where it does not cost truth. When the house settled, it sounded like a bridge in good weather, timbers speaking in the language of a structure that still knows itself. I went to bed and let that be enough. If you're still watching and wondering whether forgiveness or final confrontation will decide the ending, please comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to Chapter 9. The gallery on Uptown felt like a room that remembered my aunt's voice. Afternoon light came in through the high panes and laid long, patient rectangles across the scuffed floorboards. Dust drifted like quiet applause. I asked the manager for the back table where Lila used to sit and talk pricing with painters who thought hope could replace math. I set 3 manila envelopes on the wood as if they were levels and squares, tools to true a crooked frame. I waited until my breathing matched the tick of the wall clock. The community, being a community, behaved like weather with microclimates. At the grocery store, a neighbor who once confided recipes in the cereal aisle pretended not to see me. 2 others waved and changed nothing. I made a choice. When people asked about drama, I would talk about Lila's students and leave the rest to the minutes of courtrooms built for that purpose. It was not nobility. It was accounting. You cannot spend dignity twice. Sedona Art Center hosted a small evening for donors and stubborn believers. I stood beside a painting Lila had bought from a college senior who could not believe anyone would pay for color arranged honestly. I spoke about her way of finding edges, how she listened for craft in a room full of noise, and about the foundation we would launch to keep that listening alive. No names, no grievances, only the geometry of a gift extended forward. People clapped with the kind of relief that audiences feel when a story chooses to end in repair. Afterward, an elderly sculptor squeezed my forearm and called Lila a woman who bought time for other people's courage. I drove home grateful for sentences that do not require me to stand in them. Derek's next attempt arrived by email at 1:14 a.m., time-stamped by insomnia and bravado. The subject line promised a mutually accretive opportunity. Inside, a pitch deck borrowed fonts from Optimism and numbers from Wish. He proposed leveraging my municipal bonds as collateral for a short-term note to seize an undervalued hospitality asset, then using projected cash flow to retire the note within 6 months. There were arrows, acronyms, and an exit that assumed gravity would suspend itself for goodwill. He CC'd no one, which told me even he sensed the paper would not pass light. I forwarded it to Aisha with a single sentence, "Please archive under pattern," and closed my laptop before the screen's light could convince me it was morning. The next days arranged themselves into a rhythm I could live with. Calls with Aisha that felt like tightening hardware, emails with the gallery manager about bylaws, a walk each afternoon where I counted the steps between Pinon shadows and found the number always reasonable. Olivia sent me a photo of a supply list for the children's class she wanted to build. Brushes, paper, a drying rack, a kettle for tea. The practicality made me proud. When she came by, we sanded a table in the garage together and didn't speak until the grain lifted like small waves and lay down again. "Teaching is slower than I thought," she said. "Slow is where it learns," I said. The dog sneezed sawdust and reminded us to laugh. Aisha texted a copy of a formal retraction posted under legal advice on a local forum where Derek's friends used to speculate. It was oddly worded and completely sufficient. The Texas LLC surfaced again in a note from our investigator, not as proof but as a breadcrumb trail too deliberate to be accidental. We saved each breadcrumb. Documentation is patience in file form. One night, I caught my reflection in the dark kitchen window. A man older than the last time he checked. A man not ruined by being older. I made tea, wrote my list for the morning, called Dr. Rao to say thank you again, finalize the foundation's launch date, pick up the humidifier filter, buy paper for Olivia's class, and sat at the table where I have paid bills and buried grief and celebrated small mercies. Outside, Sedona returned to its habit of making every outline sharp. Inside, I practiced mine. Be clear, be steady, be kind where it does not cost truth. When the house settled, it sounded like a bridge in good weather, timbers speaking in the language of a structure that still knows itself. I went to bed and let that be enough. If you're still watching and wondering whether forgiveness or final confrontation will decide the ending, please comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 9. The gallery on Uptown felt like a room that remembered my aunt's voice. Afternoon light came in through the high panes and laid long, patient rectangles across the scuffed floorboards. Dust drifted like quiet applause. I asked the manager for the back table where Lila used to sit and talk pricing with painters who thought hope could replace math. I set 3 manila envelopes on the wood as if they were levels and squares, tools to true a crooked frame. I waited until my breathing matched the tick of the wall clock. Olivia arrived first, hair pulled back, shoulders squared to something only she could see. Derek followed with the momentum of a man who dislikes rooms he doesn't control. He paced along a row of small oils, studies in stone and sage, and muttered something complimentary about curation that landed like styrofoam. I gestured to the chairs. The envelopes lay where they lay. I began with the simplest truths. We could not keep hemorrhaging clarity and expect to remain a family. Money, mishandled, had the force of weather. It found every weakness, every unsealed edge. I brought proposals, I said, not threats. I slid the first envelope across. Inside was a forbearance and repayment plan. 7 years, interest below market, automatic deductions into a separate account, the calendar mapped in columns no one could misunderstand. I did not itemize each debt aloud. The table had the numbers. Saying them would only rub salt into grooves already worn. I slid the second. This one held the grant for Olivia's children's art class. Modest monthly tranches tied to clear milestones, receipts, and reports due in a cadence that honored both art and arithmetic. It authorized supplies, space rental, a small stipend, and a separate line for tea because children learn better when their hands are warm. I had asked the manager to pencil her into a Saturday morning slot if she wanted it. There was a place on the form for a date. Under it, I had written soon. The third envelope was Derek's. The language was narrow and careful. Financial counseling with a reputable program. Relinquishment of any access, direct or indirect, to my accounts. A commitment to make no representations about my finances online or off. An acknowledgement that family ties do not confer fiduciary privilege. It was the only envelope that weighed more than paper. Then I set out what would follow either signature or refusal. If they accepted, I would publicize a small scholarship in my grandson's name through the foundation, to be awarded by a committee that would outlast all of us. If they refused, I would instruct Aisha to proceed with a defamation claim and to notify the state about a questionable charitable deduction that had appeared in filings I was not supposed to have seen, but had. I said it without heat. Consequences sound less like revenge when they are made of sentences and not thunder. The room changed shape for a moment. In galleries, air shifts when people downshift from posture to listening. I felt that now. Olivia opened the grant packet and read, lips moving slightly the way she had when she learned to spell. She took a pen from her bag and underlined a line about reports. Derek did not sit. He flipped through the repayment plan with 2 quick fingers, then tapped the edge of the counseling clause as if testing bark for rot. "You built a trap," he said. I said, "I built a railing." He snorted, but it was a small sound, more leakage than opinion. Olivia looked up. "I'll sign my parts," she said. The sentence did not tremble. She tucked loose hair behind an ear and touched the date space with 1 finger. Her mouth folded around a breath she did not dramatize. She asked me to initial a statement that the class would be hers to run, not mine through her. I initialed. It felt like placing a beam on the exact mark. Derek's eyes moved between us as if we were playing a game he had not practiced. He leafed again, then returned the papers, then picked them up. He said the word control the way some people say winter. I said the word boundary the way desert people say shade. He wanted a different math. More now, fewer conditions, momentum unbothered by guardrails. I told him momentum without grading is how houses flood. He called my metaphors old. I let the gallery's quiet answer him. We sat in the hum of the building's old ductwork until the moment could choose a direction. Then Derek pushed his chair back and stood too quickly, sending a small echo into the frames. He left the envelope on the table and walked for the door with a practiced exit that still looked rehearsed. The glass sighed in its track. The manager glanced over and went back to her ledger. Olivia did not follow him. She remained still long enough for commitment to set. We completed signatures where signatures belonged. I wrote a check for the first tranche and left it in the manager's care with instructions about receipts. Olivia wrote the date, then circled it, then smiled at the circle like a student who has just mastered a shape. On the way out, I asked her to choose one small drawing from the student wall to take home. She chose a child's red rock in crayon, all angles and no apology. By the time I reached my driveway, my phone had caught up to me. The bank's fraud department had left a message. An attempt to open a margin loan secured by my municipal bonds had been blocked by a flag we had placed 2 weeks earlier. The request had pinged through an IP that matched a Texas LLC our investigator had already written down. I stood with the message buzzing in my ear and felt the hard, sober comfort of patterns confirming themselves. The trap I had not set was finding its bait. I forwarded the voicemail to Aisha and wrote the incident number on a note card for the file. Then I went into the kitchen and put on water for tea because bodies still need hot water even when paperwork heats your hands. I sat at the table and looked at the 3 folders I had brought back: repayment, grant, counseling. They did not feel like weapons. They felt like tools in a roll, buckled tight, each with a purpose, none designed to injure when used correctly. That night, I drafted a short announcement for the Foundation's website. A new scholarship, applications opening in spring, priorities aligned with Lila's stubborn love for craft. I left names off. The work should speak. The order arrived in the same beige envelope as every other notice that tries to change a life. Aisha texted me a photo from the clerk's counter. Petition denied with prejudice, findings attached, signatures neat as survey stakes. I read it at the kitchen table where I have signed tax returns and condolence cards. The dog asleep against my boot like sandbag weight. The language was dry, jurisdictions prefer water without color, but inside the dryness was relief you could stand on. The court had taken note of credentials that matched the question asked, of records that balanced across years, of affidavits written by people who had seen me forget a joke, but not a bill. It had also taken notice of what it called procedural misuse, which is a courthouse way of telling someone they tried to turn a wrench with a hammer. 2 hours later, Aisha filed the fee motion and sent me a copy of the anti-SLAPP, pleading that read like an inventory of the ways reputation can be spent by other people without your consent. She asked if I wanted to push hard. I told her to push exactly as far as the record would walk on its own and no farther. The investigator forwarded a tidy packet tracing the Texas LLC to a registered agent who rents mailboxes to other people's plans, along with the bank's log from the blocked margin loan attempt. The bank manager called to apologize for the precautionary friction of frozen balances and thanked me for being the kind of client who would rather be mildly inconvenienced than broadly ruined. I thanked him for the phrase, "It belongs on a plaque." Sedona did what small places do when a storm clears. It resumed its errands. A neighbor waved 2 fingers from a pickup. The grocery checker with the ring of keys asked if I wanted paper or plastic, as if nothing inside my name had been argued in public. The art center confirmed the Saturday slot for Olivia's class and sent a list of folding tables that didn't wobble. I chose 3, insisted on steel legs, and remembered that the first thing you owe any classroom is furniture that doesn't give up. Olivia came by with a notebook full of lists you could tell were written late. She sat, took a breath, and showed me a budget that had learned humility. Brushes that last, paper that doesn't bleed, a kettle for tea, tape that forgives mistakes. She had printed the grant schedule and tucked it into the front pocket like a promise she had made to herself. I signed the first disbursement and placed the check on top of the notebook without a speech. She touched it, didn't move it, and smiled in a way that looked like a shoulder setting. We walked out to the garage and sanded a table until the grain lay down in waves you could see even with your eyes closed. The radio in the corner spoke softly about weather. We worked until the wood told us to stop. Aisha's fee motion was granted in part the following week. Derek's lawyer filed a half-hearted opposition that argued tone instead of law, and the judge answered with sums as indifferent as arithmetic. Dr. Rao sent a final report for my file, then added a handwritten line. The mind likes being asked to show up. I placed it behind the durable power of attorney we had executed, the one that keeps confusion from becoming a business model. I file things the way I used to check rebar, with the faithlessness of a man who trusts procedures more than moods. The foundation launch happened on a Wednesday evening when the Red Rocks kept the sun a little longer as a courtesy. We hung 3 of Lila's favorites and 1 new piece from a student who worked in charcoal like it was a language left behind by the wind. I said a few words about craft and stubbornness, how Lila believed the hand learns what the heart can't articulate yet, and announced the first scholarship in my grandson's name. I left out every chapter that belonged to courtrooms. The work should talk louder than the fight to make it possible. People clapped in that quiet, grateful way communities reserve for a future they can imagine touching. A young painter thanked me without quite looking up and asked if the committee would read personal statements blind. I said yes because bias hides in eyes. By then, the retractions had begun to appear online, written under advice of counsel, stiff-backed but sufficient. The state tax office opened a file on the Phantom Charity and called Aisha for documents. I stayed out of the call and made tea. When I get tempted to narrate, I sand something. The bench in the yard can prove it. One afternoon, the bank fraud officer invited me to walk through their new alerts over coffee. He brought a binder and a look that wanted to be useful. We tuned thresholds, added human review at 2 points, and placed a hard stop on collateralized loans that smell like hurry. "You're over-fortified now," he said, half apologizing. "Good," I answered. Over-fortified is a synonym for sleeping. News travels oddly through a place like ours. I heard secondhand that Derek had stepped away from an opportunity that could not tolerate headlines, and that the tennis ladder had found a replacement who forgot scores but remembered names. A friend forwarded a screenshot of a forum apology with the edges sanded by attorneys. I did not reply. I set my phone face down and scraped the last glue line from an old picture frame until the corner closed like a healed cut. The night before Olivia's first class, we ate soup at my table and laid brushes out like instruments. She told me she would begin with color wheels, then move to shadows, then let the kids choose an object from a box and draw without erasing for a full minute. "They'll hate it," she said, "then they'll love it." I said, "That's most learning." We carried the baskets to the car. On the porch, she hugged me without hurry, then stepped back and said a single sentence that did more work than paragraphs. "Thank you for not rescuing me." I nodded. Rescue is addictive. Responsibility lasts longer. When the house was quiet again, I wrote the email I had been rehearsing. It was short. I told Derek I wished him clarity, and that if he ever wanted help drawing a map that began with the word accountability, Aisha could recommend 3 counselors who speak fluent numbers. I added a final line because courtesies are not a currency I intend to abandon. When you can be factual, I can be generous. I sent it and went outside to stand under a sky that was trying to be spring. The breeze hesitated, arrived, then left like a polite guest. Morning came, and with it the ordinary pleasures I once mistook for small. A kettle humming, a neighborhood dog insisting the day begin, an email from the art center with a photo of children at tables that did not wobble. Olivia stood behind them, sleeves rolled, a streak of Prussian blue across her thumb like a credential. The caption said, "First class full." I stared until the edges of the image sharpened into something I recognized as hope. I walked the Arroyo Loop at a pace that respected knees and wisdom. The rocks wore light the way a good structure wears load without fuss. I thought of Lila, of the habits that outlived the hands that started them, of the briefcase that no longer felt like a live wire by my chair. Before lunch, I posted the scholarship announcement to the foundation site with the application link and a photograph of Lila's crooked signature. I closed the laptop and listened for the house to speak. It did. A pipe settling, a vent clicking, the sound of a place that knows its name. I breathed and let the day be what it was, enough, earned, and mine. The morning after Olivia's first class, I woke before the heater stirred and lay still while the dark did its patient work of becoming light. Houses speak more plainly at that hour. Wood creaks without apology, ducks peeing in their metal dialect, the refrigerator hums like an old friend clearing his throat. I listened the way I used to listen to a bridge under load, not for drama but for steadiness. When the kettle finally began its small sermon, I rose and moved through the rooms like a caretaker, which is what I have been all my life. Of projects, of people, of promises I made to myself when no one else was taking notes. I poured coffee and stood at the kitchen window. The red rocks wore the kind of winter light that flattens everything but truth. I thought of Aunt Lila's stubbornness, of the portfolio that now felt less like treasure and more like timber, useful only if milled with intention. I thought, too, of the briefcase by the chair, of how its weight had shifted over months from anxiety to administration, from a secret with teeth to a file box with tabs. Some objects are dangerous only when you let them be metaphors. Once you assign them a job, they behave. I took the foundation folder from the credenza and flipped through the bylaws and checklists that Aisha helped me build. The scholarship announcement was live. The application period had dates that would not move. The committee list was long enough to outlast any one person's mood. I ran a finger along the timeline and felt the quiet relief of systems that don't need a hero to function. It is a strange kind of joy to discover that the most loving thing you can do is design yourself out of the choke point. Out in the shop, I clamped a length of mesquite and set the plane to work. The blade took off curls that fell like script across the bench, each shaving a sentence in a language the hands remember before the head does. I have always believed craft is the opposite of panic. Panic lunges, crafter returns to the line, and checks. With every pass, the boards declared what it wanted to be, and my job was not to impose, but to uncover. That is what this season has taught me about family. You don't engineer people. You true the edges and refuse to lie about the grain. I spent part of the afternoon at the gallery, then walked the loop along the arroyo, watching thaw water negotiate its way through last night's stubbornness. The desert manages instruction without speeches. It shows you that boundaries are not meanness, they are the shape of survival. The sand accepts the channel not because it is weak, but because it is wise. I remembered everything I had mistaken for kindness over the years, checks written to quiet fear, favors extended to muffle my own loneliness, and I let those choices stand as lessons rather than indictments. You can forgive yourself without pretending you were right. Back home, Olivia's text arrived with a photo from class number 2. Children leaned over paper that didn't buckle, their faces lit by concentration more than by the room's soft bulbs. She had written one sentence beneath the image. They forgot to ask when snack was. I smiled, because that is how you know learning has started. I replied with a line she would hear in my voice, "Slow is where it learns." We do not own each other's progress. We witness it. Near dusk, I wrote a letter to my grandson in the voice I would want to find if, years from now, he cared to open a drawer and discover what his grandfather valued. I told him about Lila's belief that work should be honest even when no one is watching, about the way bridges hold because the math is obeyed, not because anyone claps. I told him that money is a tool that will burn the hand that grips it as identity, and that generosity without boundaries spoils both the giver and the receiver. At the bottom, I added a line I wanted him to memorize. When you can be factual, you can be generous. I sealed the envelope and placed it with the foundation papers, because some messages should wait for the right season. Later, I sat at the table and made 2 short lists. One was titled Keep, and under it I wrote, calm records, tea, walking, laughter that doesn't cost anyone, doors that close when necessary. The other was titled Learn, and I wrote, say no sooner, build systems before storms. Do not mistake volume for merit. Let adults do their own arithmetic. The lists were not particularly poetic, but a life is a ledger before it is a story. The numbers have to add up or the plot will not hold. Aisha called to confirm our last filings had been accepted and to say that the bank's controls were now codified rather than improvised. Her voice carried the tired satisfaction of a pilot after a clean landing. "You're boring," she said, a smile inside the words. "Stay that way." We promised each other lunch that wasn't a meeting. Dr. Rao sent a handwritten note that belonged in a frame. The mind appreciates being invited to work. I tucked it into the folder where I keep reminders of who I want to be when nobody requires it. There is a version of this chapter that ends with triumph, but I do not trust triumph. It is too loud. The quieter ending is better. Derek did not become a villain because I needed one. He became a cautionary equation solved in public. I do not know what he will do next, and I do not intend to guess. A court cannot legislate character, only conduct. The rest is up to a person and the weather inside his head. My job is to keep my boundaries sound and my welcome honest. If someday he arrives with facts instead of improvisations, I have left a path to the porch that does not require me to pretend amnesia. After dinner, I walked to the house again, latches, pilot lights, the small infrastructure of peace. In the bedroom, I paused by Ellen's photo and let memory fold without collapsing. Grief is not the enemy of boundaries, it is their reason. You draw lines so the things you promised the dead have some place to live. I promised her to care for our daughter without erasing myself. It took me longer than I meant, but I am learning the cadence now. Before sleep, I stepped onto the porch. The sky was clean as new paper. Somewhere down the hill, a coyote tested a note and gave up. The air carried that late winter weightlessness that makes you believe spring might risk itself again. I stood there with a house behind me that knows its name, a daughter who is building something slow and durable, a foundation that will outlast my better days and my worse. I thought of all the years I measured my worth by the crises I could smother. It turns out worth can be measured by the quiet you protect and the systems you leave behind. Inside, I turned off the last lamp and told the dark what I tell every structure I've ever loved: hold. Then I lay down and let the day close like a well-hung door, true, quiet, and finally mine. In the end, every story of betrayal and redemption reminds us that true strength is not measured by wealth or victory, but by the ability to stand firm in dignity, to protect boundaries, and to find peace in integrity. Life will always test us with storms, but what remains is the quiet lesson. Respect is earned by truth, and healing comes when we refuse to let bitterness write the final chapter. Thank you for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe, and join us for more stories that inspire and challenge.